10 a.m. on the West Coast, 1 p.m. on the East Coast. This is Live with the Guy. Before we get into today's news, I would just like to say Claudia Sheinbaum is now the president of Mexico. It's no longer AMLO Obrador. He is supposedly going into retirement. I'm very interested to see what he actually does. Will he, behind the scenes, work with the BRICS? Because Claudia Sheinbaum is obviously going to have to do trade with the United States. So I'm going to really be keeping an eye on that. But today's actual news stories I'm going to be talking about is Doug Emhoff. If you don't know who Doug Emhoff is, that's Kamala Harris's husband. He's talking a lot about masculinity and what it means to be a man. That's funny coming from somebody that hits a woman in the lineup of the Cannes Film Festival so hard she spun around. We'll get into that story. After that, we're going to get into the dock worker strike. It hasn't been stopped, as you might have heard, but it's been delayed until January 15th. So could this be a trap for Trump to fall into? We'll have to see. Then we have Trudeau. Trudeau is having a major scandal in Canadian politics. I've talked about it over the last couple days, but now there's talk of a snap election around Christmas time. This election wasn't supposed to come to next year, but it could come a lot sooner now. Then we're going to go into some Canadian bills. These bills are very important for Mexico and the United States because it shows how governments are trying to push in woke ideology through government and through legislation. One of the bills we'll be talking about is Bill C-293. This is the Pandemic Preparedness Bill, also known as the Vegan Bill. They're trying to take meat away from Canadians. Also, the big bill, it's been out for a long time, but in researching Bill 293, Bill C-63 came up, and this is the Online Harms Act. This is probably one of the most villainous bills that have ever been suggested by a modern liberal government. We'll go into that. We'll see what Jordan Peterson has to say about that as well. Then we have UBI. UBI is making people poorer. That's what a study shows. I got some references for that. And the last story we'll be going into is oil tankers in Iran. They're beginning to flee. And let's go into the first story here. So Doug Emhoff is married to Kamala Harris. His ex-girlfriend that he was dating for 3 months, they went to the Cannes Film Festival, and he supposedly or allegedly smacked her so hard that she did a loop-de-loop. And now he wants to come out and talk about what masculinity is and how J.D. Vance and Donald Trump are extremely toxic. Now, this wouldn't normally bother me, but Kamala Harris isn't talking about this. Other people in the campaign, like Tim Walz, isn't talking about this, but Kamala Harris's husband, the one person who is a woman abuser, is trying to call out Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. This is absolutely sickening. Let's watch what he has to say.
Two guys who actually not only don't trust women, but are literally running on a platform of authoritarianism and misogyny. That literally should be their slogan, because that's what it is. So you want, people who literally are outwardly misogynistic in their policies and the way they talk about women and the policies in which they've already enacted and have talked about enacting. Or Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. It's completely binary.
And then it turns out that he's...
Okay, that's good. Or Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. No, not Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, and definitely not you. I don't know who you are to think you can talk about these subjects when you should be in jail over this. I don't know how he got off on this. Maybe she didn't press charges, but supposedly, from what I was reading, she's a lawyer in she was a lawyer in New York. So maybe it was an out-of-court settlement or something like this. But let's go into the second clip, which is even more atrocious than the first one. It's the timestamp is 5:16. And this is going to go until 6:55. So it's quite a long clip. I may talk over a little bit so we don't get a copyright strike.
Talked about your role here is how your role has reshaped the perception of masculinity. And I'm not sure you planned on that, but you are an incredibly supportive spouse. Has that been an evolution for you? And do you think that's part of the role you might play as first gentleman?
It's funny. I've started to think a lot about this. I've always been like this. My dad was like this. And
we just talk about masculinity for a moment. has being second gentleman changed your own view of perceived gender roles or what it means to be a man?
This is something I've thought about a lot and something I've spoken about a lot. There's too much of toxicity, masculine toxicity out there, and we've kind of confused what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine, where you've got this trope out there that you've got to be tough and, angry and lash out to be strong. It's just the opposite. Strength is how you show your love for people. Strength is how you are for people and how you have their back and how you stick up for other people and pushing out against bullies. I mean, that's what I believe it is. So every time I can speak against this toxicity, we're seeing it with our younger people. We're seeing it in our discourse and our politics, in the media. You're seeing it as it relates to so many of the issues that we're pushing back on. So I think it's a problem, and I'm going to continue to use this platform every time I get to speak out against this toxic masculinity that's out there.
This
guy is no role model. This is a liberal cuck that is trying to tell men how to be masculine and how to be a man. Now, liberals would say Andrew Tate is toxic. Now, I will say I don't agree with everything Andrew Tate says, but at least he gives some solid advice. This guy is just a liar, smacking women around in public in the Cannes Film Festival line. Now, with Andrew Tate, I will say, why should you not listen to Andrew Tate, or what shouldn't you listen to him about? I would say he's overly materialistic, and once you start trying to go after all these fast cars, big houses, things like this, you're going to be on a hamster wheel, and it's never going to be enough. You're never going to be satisfied. So learn to be satisfied with the things and the dreams that you do have. But I will say Andrew Tate does give a lot of good advice. This guy, on the other hand, is just something else. He is using liberal politics as some kind of social justice shield to say what toxic masculinity is and isn't. I'll tell you what it isn't. It isn't this guy. Anyway, let's go into the dock workers strike. Now, I've been reporting a lot on this, and it was very interesting that Kamala Harris came out immediately, supported the dock workers, and then they came to a quick deal. Was this prearranged or pre-organized? I don't know. I am glad they did come to a deal, especially because of the hurricanes and flood disaster area that's going on right now. They need those ports to be open. So this port deal is a temporary deal, and it only lasts until January 15th. That's going to be right around the time Donald Trump takes office if he wins the election. If he wins, we're going to know November 5th. Then big January 6th is when he's going to be sworn in. I think January 20th is when he takes full power. So this dock worker strike could be in full swing when Trump takes office. And if you don't know anything about this dock workers union, massive amounts of money, over $1.5 million have been donated to the Biden campaign. So they're big supporters of the Democrats. I know the Democrats, especially when they're this far behind, that they could be laying traps for Trump. So traps for Trump would be like huge economic trap, or a war trap in the Middle East or in Ukraine, things like this. Donald Trump's going to have to come in and negotiate big deals right off the bat. If he's not able to do it, the repercussions could be the economy would completely collapse. So it's going to be very interesting to see what Donald Trump does if and when he gets into office. Again, I am glad the dock workers were able to negotiate a temporary deal. But we also know Joe Biden could have made these dock workers go back to work for 80 days. And so negotiating half the deal now was maybe a good idea for the dock workers. They got a lot of what they wanted in this contract negotiation rather than being forced to go back to work. And after that 80 days, if they did come back to the strike, then they wouldn't have had as much negotiating power. So negotiating half the contract now, where they had heightened leverage over the government and things like this, was a good idea. They're going to also have a lot of leverage going into the next negotiation. The problem is they're going to be going up against the guy that wrote the book, The Art of the Deal. So we'll keep a look on the dock worker strike. It will pop up again around January 15th of next year. Next, I'm going to go into this Justin Trudeau snap election that people are beginning to talk about that could happen in December. Now, if you don't know or you didn't watch yesterday's show, there's a huge scandal going on right now in Canada, and Justin Trudeau turned over a bunch of documents, but he turned them over completely redacted, meaning the RCMP, which is the police force in Canada, wasn't able to properly investigate the Liberal government. Now he's being forced to resubmit the documents unredacted. He's refusing to do that right now. So as a consequence, all Liberal business in Parliament is completely shut down. That means all bills they want to get through, and they have some very important bills they're trying to get through right now that could massively affect the election and the quality of life of Canadians going forward into the future. Some of these bills they're proposing are absolutely legislatively insane. But going back to the snap election that may happen around Christmas time, which would be just after the American election. So you could see a conservative government take power in the United States and then a conservative government take power in Canada. But there's the three options here are he doesn't turn over the documents. And if he doesn't turn over the documents, no Liberal business can go forward in Parliament, which would basically have the other three parties within Canada call a snap election, which would mean a December election, most likely in Canada. His second option is to turn over the documents unredacted. This would be a great option, but maybe not a great option for him because he may be implicated in a lot of this money that was funneled to different corporations, different people illegally. The second in command, which would be Miss Freeland, which is the finance minister, could also be implicated in these. So that could affect what the third option is. And the third option would be to not redact the documents, but to replace Justin Trudeau as the prime minister. And who that would be with Christina Freeland. And if she's implicated in these documents, they might not want to put her as the party whip. So what I think will most likely happen is he's going to unredact the documents, but we'll have to see. I really do hope there is a snap election so the Conservative Party can take power and they can start reversing a lot of what Justin Trudeau's implemented over the last 10 years. Okay. Now, as I was researching the Justin Trudeau snap election that could take place, I was going into this bill C-293, which is known as the Pandemic Preparedness Bill. Now, this bill is a pandemic preparedness bill, but it's also known as the vegan bill. It's a very broad-ranging bill that is not very specific. It gives the government a ton of power, but doesn't really specify the limits of that power. This is much, the bill really reminds me of what the WHO, the World Health Organization, was trying to implement on a global basis for a bunch of governments around the world. This seems to be the Canadian idea of the WHO bill, but specifically done to just affect Canadians by the Liberal government. Now, the part of the bill I really dug into was the replacing traditional meats and meat production and converting that over to vegan proteins. They seem to think it's a big security risk during a pandemic to have meat production, and they want to transition the Canadian public into vegan proteins. And it looks like to me they're trying to turn the Canadian population vegan. I know when I was living in Canada, I was eating a lot of meat, and a lot of the chicken was feeling rubbery to me, and it just didn't feel like meat. And my back didn't feel good when I was there. Since I came to Mexico, the meat actually looks, feels, and tastes like meat. So are they already tampering with the food supply? I don't know. I don't want to make any wild accusations. But the fact that they're trying to get rid of meat in this bill specifically is absolutely crazy. Also, while I was watching some videos of some people go over this bill and what's in this bill is not, a pandemic is not required for this bill, which really surprised me. It's called a pandemic preparedness bill. So what that means is they can implement these things in preparation for a pandemic, which would be right now. Because there is no pandemic right now. If this bill is passed, they'll begin to implement a lot of these policies. So for people to think they're going to have a pandemic in order to implement pandemic policies. That's not the case, which is pretty radical to me because I really thought freedoms were being infringed during the pandemic, and I don't want to go back to that. But the fact that governments are preparing bills and legislation to implement on the general population now when we're not in a pandemic, claiming they need to be prepared for the next one, is absolutely insane. Now, as crazy as that Bill C-293 is, I will say Bill C-63 is the most draconian bill I've ever seen. If you study only one bill between Bill C-293 or Bill C-63, research Bill C-63. If the Canadian government is able to implement this legislation, it's going to have massive impacts on Canadian society going forward for decades. Let's play what Jordan Peterson said about this.
Woke mob has managed to extend themselves even further into the legal Netherlands with a new bill called C-63, which isn't law in Canada yet, but is soon likely to be. And it is the most totalitarian Western bill I've ever seen by quite a large margin and in multiple dimensions.
In an attempt to just
Okay, this is called the Bill C-63. It's an Online Harms Act. It was originally in the form of a different bill, which was Bill C-32 or something like that. And it just rose too many red flags. So what the Liberal government did was repackage the bill and an online harms act, saying they had to protect children from online harms, but they shoved all this other stuff that was in Bill C-32 into this bill. What this bill does is it enacts hate speech to a whole new level. If you have speech online that is at any way, shape, or form harmful or hateful, and it's just perceived to be hateful, and somebody makes an accusation, you can receive a life sentence in Canada. If this bill passes, it's going to be absolutely insane. Also, other things that are happening with this bill is just draconian punishments for speech. Now, Canada doesn't have free speech like the United States, so they've been implementing all these little bills that they can lock people up if they say specific things about your gender, about what is a man, what is a woman. They're able to lock you up in Canada for not using pronouns, things like this. But this bill is an all-encompassing act that can lock people up for large periods of time. It would dramatically curb all conservative speech within Canada. If you don't have a progressive liberal ideology and you don't agree with progressive liberal ideals, then you're not, that's fine. You're just not allowed to talk about it anymore if this bill passes. I highly recommend people research this bill more on their own. I will be leaving a link in the description for a video that I watched from True North that was very eye-opening, and I will be going more into this bill in the future in detail. This was kind of a last-minute thing that came up for me when I was researching Bill C-293. I just remembered about Bill C-63, which is far more draconian. Okay, next we're going to go into UBI. Sam Altman-Fried had done a research study through OpenAI about UBI. If you don't know what UBI is, it's Universal Basic Income. Now, I think this is a good idea, and there needs to be more research done on it and how it would be implemented, specifically because of AI. If AI becomes a huge part of society and starts taking jobs en masse, what are we going to do with people? We can't just let them starve and be on the street. So depending on the impact of AI, we may need a UBI. But what this UBI study found, I think much to the disgrin of Sam Altman-Fried, I don't think that's what they wanted, was it found people got poorer with UBI, they work less, and they had less incentive to work hard. Now, I will say this, if AI becomes extremely prevalent and people start losing their jobs, you're going to have a temporary stopgap. So you're going to have to give money out most likely. But when you give that money out, it's going to increase the prices of goods and everything else and inflation. So there's negative impacts to giving out direct money to people with UBI. And those impacts are goods and services are going to go up, and the UBI that is given out will continuously have to they'll continuously have to give people more and more and more UBI just to keep up with prices, which will then inflate prices. So it's kind of this hamster wheel that one thing makes the other thing increase, which makes the other thing increase. I think a better strategy would be how do we want to shape society if AI becomes so prevalent it takes the majority of jobs in society? And I would suggest maybe going into a farming style culture where maybe the government gives lands away and gives help and assistance for people to farm those lands, to build houses on those lands, for fertilizer, to set up educational systems to teach people how to farm. That way people become self-sufficient on the lands they're given to farm. So it wouldn't be direct cash infusements into the population. You would actually be given the population land and an education on how to farm. That way nobody's going to starve if they know how to farm and everybody has land and things like this. Also, it's a good environment to raise children in, as on a farm. Farms teach children everything they need to know in a simplified environment. So rather than giving direct infusements of cash, thinking of an alternative way to build the society that we want based around family and things like this. I'm not saying my idea of farming is the be all end all, or I've thought it out immensely. What I am saying is we need to think of systems other than direct cash infusements of UBI that can shape society into a way that us as a populace want things to be, not the way that this crazy liberal government wants us to live in pods and eat bugs. We really want to think this out so we don't end up in a pod and we're not eating bugs. Going forward, I actually missed one of a few of the talking points I was going to talk about in Bill C-293. And some of the things that came up when I was researching that story were the cricket farms subsidies within Canada. Canada has some of the largest cricket farms in the world, other than the UK. The UK actually has the largest cricket farm. Now, Canadians and Americans aren't openly eating crickets. Who are Koreans. So a lot of these crickets are being shipped out to Korea. The Canadian government is subsidizing the mass production of crickets so we can feed people in Korea, rather than figuring out how we can create a sustainable food network within Canada to feed Canadian people. Also, I'm going to talk about this dairy processing facility that's by Kingston, Ontario. It's called Canadian Royal Mill. It's been subsidized to the tune of $50 million by the Canadian government. Now, that in itself isn't a bad thing. It's a dairy processing facility. The issue that I'm having with this is it's been subsidized to the tune of $50 million. And guess who owns it? The Chinese government. And what is this dairy processing facility producing? It's producing primarily right now baby formula. Now, we know what happened in the pandemic with baby formula and all the other kind of food manufacturing scandals that have come out involving the Chinese government. So allowing the Chinese government to come into Canada to produce the food and then subsidizing them on top of it, that seems like a national security risk to me. And it's not only a national security risk to Canadians, but also to Americans, because a lot of this baby formula and food products are going to be shipped down to the United States. So if anybody in the United States is watching, I'm really hoping that Canada, America, and Mexico get control over their food production. And also, I want to see a diverse food production going on. What do I mean by that? We don't only need mass manufacturing of food, but that mass manufacturing of food has to be transparent. Because what we don't want are GMO corns and other things coming into the food supply. Also, I want small local organic farms to be a huge portion of how this food is supplied to people in the United States, Canada, and the rest of the world. This makes the food supply a lot more versatile, a lot harder to tamper with for foreign governments and things like this. And it's just better when we have the general population locally producing food for the local population. And then, so we have a backstop to that. If something goes wrong, we have mass industrial manufacturing of food, but we have it in a safe and healthy way. Okay. Whew, that's a lot. Okay. We're going to go into the oil tankers fleeing Iran now. Now, this has a lot to do with the Israel situation. This situation seems to be progressing. Iran keeps hitting back, but they keep hitting back in a very controlled manner, meaning not a lot of people are dying when they're hitting back. And the issue I'm having with this is Israel keeps escalating, which is a problem if they escalate to the next level. And the next level is expected to be this island in Iran where 90% of all the oil production passes through there. If Israel potentially hits this target, which is a very easy target to hit, that's going to devastate all oil production in Iran, but not just Iran. It's going to devastate oil production in the entire rest of the world. Iran is threatening its neighbors right now, saying if this island is hit, that they're going to hit their neighbors in the Middle East. Also, that Iran is saying they're going to shut down where this island is at, which the majority of the world's Middle Eastern oil goes through this strait, which I believe is called the Strait of Malacca. And if that happens, oil prices are going to shoot through the roof. And I will say the one thing about diversifying into wind and solar is a lot of people have solar panels on their roof. So if if oil production completely shuts down or prices go through the roof, people that do have solar panels, this is a way that at least electrical energy is diversified. So that would be one good benefit to the diversity into green energy over the last few years. I know I've been somewhat against it overall, but if oil prices go through the roof, I am going to be glad we had at least a little bit of backup for regular populations to use so they don't go without electricity. Am I expecting this to amp up? I am. I think the war between Iran and Israel is going to become larger and larger hits. I don't know if Israel is stupid enough to hit this island where 90% of oil for Iran is going through, because they're not just going to hurt Iran. They're going to hurt the entire globe. And if they do that and oil prices shoot through the roof and the whole world begins to struggle and energy prices go up, there's going to be a huge resentment towards Israel. So I don't think Israel, in one way, they don't want to hit it, but it's such an easy target, they might. Okay, I guess that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. I'm back today with the beautiful Nat at 4 p.m. West Coast time, 7 p.m. East Coast time. Adios.